You think you know the Vikings, but you've only heard the sagas. We're taught to imagine them as fearless raiders, master shipbuilders, and bold explorers who carved their place into history with steel and fire. They are painted as the ultimate rebels of the medieval world, storming monasteries, discovering new lands, and living by codes of honor that turned warriors into legends. From television dramas to school textbooks, the Viking has become a hero, savage perhaps, but noble in his ferocity, a man of courage and freedom. But behind the heroic myths lies a disturbing truth. The sagas, written centuries later, glorified battles and voyages while silencing the suffering that funded Viking wealth. Hidden behind carved prows and shining swords was a different empire, one built not only on raids but on slave markets. Women, children, and even priests were dragged from their homes, chained, branded, and sold in bustling Viking ports like Dublin, Hedeby, and Birka. For every saga of bravery, there were countless untold stories of terror, voices erased, lives reduced to commodities. The reality was as cruel as it was deliberate. Captives were not simply byproducts of conquest, they were the very fuel of the Viking economy. Human bodies were sold beside silver, amber, and furs, enriching the same kings and jarls celebrated as adventurers. Some captives were forced into households as thralls, enduring lives of backbreaking labor and abuse. Others were shipped down the rivers of Russia toward the great markets of the East, where eunuchs and concubines filled harems, their origins forgotten. This was the side of Viking power no saga dared to record, the machinery of slavery that made their glory possible. And so, the question becomes unavoidable. Why do the sagas, those treasured sources of Viking culture, remain silent about these horrors? Why did the chroniclers celebrate raids but omit the screams of captives? Was it shame, denial, or a deliberate act of myth-making designed to polish the legacy of Norse power? Today, we peel back the curtain. For the Vikings, remembered as explorers and warriors, were also traffickers and tormentors, their empire of freedom built on human bondage. To see them clearly, we must step beyond the myths of honor and into the shadows they tried to hide. Modern culture loves to glamorize the Vikings. They appear as rugged heroes in sagas, novels, and television series. Fierce raiders, fearless explorers, and democratic farmers who lived by codes of honor. We admire their longships as marvels of engineering, their settlements as bold outposts of survival, their warriors as symbols of freedom and defiance against kings and priests. The myth is intoxicating. The Vikings as an early version of the modern rebel, untamed and proud, bound together by loyalty and strength. This image did not appear by accident. The sagas, written centuries after the Viking Age, were crafted by descendants who wanted to polish their ancestors' legacy. They celebrated voyages to Greenland and Vinland, heroic duels under the Northern Lights, and dynastic rivalries that played out like epic dramas. What they omitted was just as telling. While sagas describe raids in vivid detail, they rarely mention what became of the captives taken. The silence is deafening. Thousands of men, women, and children vanished into bondage, yet their voices were erased, their suffering excised from the record. The myth of civilization, brave, honorable Norse families, depended on ignoring the blood that oiled its gears. Later, history only deepened the polish. 19th century nationalists in Scandinavia embraced the Viking image as a symbol of strength and independence. Scholars highlighted ship burials, jewelry, and runestones while minimizing evidence of slavery. In the 20th century, popular culture turned Vikings into romantic adventurers. Films showed them as brutal but free, wild but noble. The darker truths, shackles, branding irons, the cries of children ripped from their mothers, were pushed aside, inconvenient for the myth. Yet archaeology tells another story. At sites like Dublin, Hedeby, and Birka, remains of slave markets have been uncovered. Iron collars, chains, and cramped holding areas. Foreign chronicles, from Arab merchants to Irish monks, record Viking raids not only as battles, but as human hunts. Al-Tartushi, an Arab traveller, described Viking women enslaved and forced into humiliating labour. Irish annals speak of entire villages emptied, their people marched away in chains. These accounts pierce the silence of the sagas, showing us what the Norse themselves preferred to hide. The contradiction is striking. The same society remembered for thing assemblies, where free men debated laws, also thrived on denying freedom to countless others. Viking prosperity was built not just on silver from raids, but on human bodies sold across continents. While the sagas tell of honor and bravery, the reality was exploitation and bondage. The myth of Viking civilization as rugged independence collapses when we uncover the truth of how dependent it was on slavery. And yet, the myth persists. Even today, television series, festivals, and reenactments celebrate Viking raids as thrilling spectacles. Ships are rebuilt, costumes donned, and heroes invoked. Rarely do these recreations pause to ask, who paid the price? What lives were destroyed, so that these voyages could be remembered as glorious? The myth of Viking civilization remains powerful because it is comforting. It allows us to admire courage without confronting cruelty, to celebrate exploration without acknowledging exploitation. But the silence is itself a clue, a deliberate omission that reveals how deeply slavery was woven into Viking life. To expose this truth is not to deny their achievements, but to see them in full, not only as explorers and warriors, but as traffickers and tormentors. The sagas gave us heroes, but archaeology and chronicles reveal a harsher reality. And it is in this contrast between myth and truth, glory and horror, that we begin to uncover the forbidden history the Vikings tried to bury. To understand the Vikings beyond their sagas, we must step into their true empire, not their battlefields, but their slave markets. For while Viking ships carried warriors across seas, those same vessels also carried human cargo. The thrall system was not a side effect of raiding. It was a central pillar of Viking wealth. Raids targeted not only treasures but people. Monasteries, villages, and coastal towns were chosen as much for their inhabitants as for their silver. Monks were dragged from sanctuaries, peasants torn from fields, and children wrenched from their mothers. Captives were marched in chains, sometimes for weeks, to be sold at distant markets. They were branded, shackled, and stripped of identity, transformed into commodities. Dublin, Hedeby, and Birka were among the most infamous hubs. In Dublin, founded by Norse settlers, chronicles describe bustling markets where Irish captives were traded in staggering numbers. Hedeby, a powerful Danish port, linked northern Europe to wider trade networks, where thralls were sold alongside amber and furs. Birka, on Lake Mälaren in Sweden, connected to routes stretching eastward, feeding human cargo into the arteries of the Viking economy. The brutality was systematic. Captives were displayed like livestock, inspected for strength, beauty, or obedience. Women were especially prized, sold as domestic servants or concubines, their bodies treated as extensions of the marketplace. Children, small and easy to transport, fetched high prices. Even skilled captives, monks who could write, artisans who could craft, were sold for greater sums, their talents exploited by new masters. Farther east, the Volga trade routes opened, doors to even larger markets. Viking merchants travelled deep into what is now Russia, linking Scandinavian slave traders with the Islamic caliphates. Arab sources describe markets in which Viking slavers sold boys castrated for harems, girls destined for concubinage, and men forced into labour. Here, the Viking reputation as fearless traders merged with a more disturbing truth. They were middlemen in one of the most brutal economies of the medieval world. The scale was staggering. Some scholars estimate that hundreds of thousands of people passed through Viking slave markets over the centuries. Archaeological digs have uncovered mass graves of captives who did not survive transport, skeletons showing signs of shackles or violent deaths. In some cases, when markets overflowed or ships were overburdened, captives were slaughtered en masse, easier to kill than to feed. What makes this all the more haunting is its absence in Norse sagas. Tales of raids celebrate plunder but omit what happened afterward. Heroes are praised for bravery, but the suffering of those chained beneath deck planks is never told. The omission was not accidental, it was deliberate. Slavery was essential to Viking prosperity, yet to include it in sagas would tarnish the myth of honor that their descendants worked so hard to preserve. The silence contrasts sharply with foreign records. Irish annals mourn the loss of entire villages, their people sold into bondage. Arab travelers wrote with shock of the cruelty of Viking traders, describing markets where human lives were treated as casually as spices or weapons. Even Byzantine records speak of Viking mercenaries who trafficked in captives as much as they fought. These accounts reveal a world the sagas chose to bury, an empire not of noble freedom but of ruthless exploitation. Slave markets were not hidden at the edges of Viking society. They were at its heart. The wealth that funded longships, feasts, and monuments was drawn from human suffering. The stories of Viking glory cannot be separated from the cries of captives, sold under open skies, their lives reduced to coin. And so, the contradiction sharpens. The Vikings, remembered as explorers and warriors, were also traffickers and tormentors. Their power built not only on raids, but on the systematic sale of human lives. To confront this truth is to peel back the myth of Norse honor and see the darker empire that thrived beneath it. If the Viking slave markets were the machinery of their economy, then the practices that sustained them were its darkest gears. These were not merely transactions of human bodies. They were acts of humiliation, violence, and ritualized cruelty that stripped captives of dignity and turned suffering into spectacle. The sagas do not tell these stories, but foreign chronicles, archaeology, and fragments of memory force us to confront them. The treatment of women was especially disturbing. Female captives were not only forced into domestic labor, many were turned into concubines, their bodies used to reward warriors or sold for profit. In Norse households, thrall women were expected to serve meals by day and endure sexual exploitation by night. Their children, born of coercion, were often treated as property themselves, absorbed into the thrall class regardless of their parentage. In some cases, daughters of high-born families captured in raids were paraded as trophies, forced to share beds with men who once stormed their villages. To the Vikings, this was not shameful, it was power displayed through domination. Children, too, were victims of terrifying practices. Accounts from Arab merchants suggest that some Viking traders castrated boys before selling them into markets farther east. Eunuchs commanded higher prices in the Islamic world, and Norsemen learned to profit from this brutal demand. The mutilation was often performed with crude instruments, leaving many to die in agony. Those who survived carried scars that testified to the commodification of innocence itself. When profit was threatened, captives were discarded with shocking brutality. Chronicles tell of entire groups of slaves slaughtered when transport became impractical. Ships overloaded with plunder sometimes tossed human cargo overboard to lighten the weight, leaving chained bodies to sink in silence beneath the waves. In other cases, when famine struck, slave owners killed their thralls rather than feed them, their deaths treated as an economic calculation. Ritual humiliation was also woven into the fabric of slavery. Captives were paraded through towns, beaten, or forced to perform degrading tasks in public. Some were tattooed or branded with iron to mark ownership, their bodies permanently scarred as living proof of their servitude. Others were forced to wear collars or shackles even while working in fields, their chains not only practical restraints, but symbols of degradation. These practices crushed not just the body, but the spirit, reminding captives daily that they were commodities, not people. Some captives were sacrificed to the gods. Archaeological evidence suggests that human offerings were occasionally part of Viking religious rituals, especially during times of crisis. Thralls, seen as expendable, were sometimes killed in ceremonies meant to appease Odin or Thor. Their deaths were staged as sacred acts, yet beneath the cloak of religion lay cruelty disguised as devotion. Imagine a captive, bound and terrified, slaughtered while nobles feasted, their suffering reframed as divine necessity. Even survival was no guarantee of dignity. Thralls lived under constant surveillance, their every move subject to punishment. Beatings were routine, mutilations common. Runaway slaves who were caught could have their Achilles tendons severed to prevent escape, a permanent reminder of failed defiance. Some were blinded, their usefulness limited to simple labor, while others were executed as warnings. In this way, fear was institutionalized, ensuring that resistance remained rare. The hypocrisy is staggering. The same culture that celebrated bravery and freedom in its sagas thrived on stripping both from others. The Vikings exalted honor, yet trafficked in humiliation. They praised loyalty among comrades, yet betrayed the most basic bonds of humanity with the sale and mutilation of captives. Their myths of fierce independence collapse under the weight of their dependence on bondage. What makes these practices even more chilling is their silence in Norse sources. Sagas speak of raids as victories, not kidnappings. They celebrate treasures, but omit the screams of children torn from their mothers. They glorify households while ignoring the thralls who built and maintained them. The absence is not oversight, it is deliberate erasure, a rewriting of history to preserve the illusion of honor. Foreign observers, however, did not share this silence. Arab chroniclers described Viking markets with horror, noting both the cruelty of traders and the misery of captives. Christian monks lamented the destruction of monasteries, not only for stolen relics, but for brothers dragged into chains. Even Byzantine records hinted at Viking mercenaries who enriched themselves as much through slave trafficking as through military service. These accounts stand as testimony to the practices the sagas concealed. The disturbing truth is unavoidable. Viking society was built not only on courage and exploration, but on the systematic dehumanization of others. Their markets thrived on suffering, their rituals normalized cruelty, and their prosperity depended on practices so dark that later generations chose to forget them. The sagas tell us of honor. Archaeology tells us of shackles. And in this contrast lies the forbidden story the Vikings tried to bury. If the Viking slave markets were brutal in their capture and sale, the daily lives of those who survived were no less horrific. For the enslaved, the thralls, existence meant endless labor, constant surveillance, and a crushing absence of freedom. Their world was defined not by honor, as the sagas celebrated, but by humiliation and fear. Most thralls worked the land. They plowed fields, tended livestock, and harvested crops that enriched their masters. While free Norse farmers presided over feasts, thralls toiled in the mud, often barefoot and branded. They slept in cramped huts or barns, sometimes alongside animals, denied even the dignity of space. Food was meager, bread crusts, porridge, and scraps of meat. What little strength they gained was quickly drained by relentless work from dawn to dusk. Women bore the heaviest burdens. They cooked, cleaned, wove cloth, fetched water, and served their masters with little reprieve. Many endured repeated sexual exploitation, used as concubines or breeding tools to produce more laborers. Children born to thralls inherited their mother's status, trapped from birth in the same cycle of bondage. A woman's body was not her own. It was property, her identity erased by servitude. Discipline was harsh and ever-present. A thrall who disobeyed could be beaten, mutilated, or executed. Branding irons marked their skin as belonging to a master, while iron collars and shackles were used to enforce control. Punishments for escape attempts were especially cruel. Some had their feet maimed to prevent running, others blinded or killed as warnings. Fear was not incidental. It was the glue that held the system together. The psychological toll was immense. Captives lived with the constant knowledge that their lives could be traded away at a whim. Families were often split, children sold to other households or sent along trade routes never to be seen again. Bonds of kinship, the very core of Norse free society, were systematically destroyed for the enslaved. For them, loyalty and honor meant nothing. Survival was the only code. Even within households, thralls were kept at the margins. Free men and women dined in halls, boasting of raids and reciting sagas, while thralls served silently, invisible, except when needed. Their voices, their stories, their pain never entered the record. They were the shadows that kept the fire burning, their humanity deliberately erased from the narrative of Viking glory. And yet, thralls shaped Viking society in ways often overlooked. They built the farms that fed warriors, rowed ships that carried plunder, and crafted goods traded across Europe. The very foundation of Norse prosperity rested on their labor. Without thralls, the myth of free, independent Viking farmers collapses. Their so-called freedom was made possible only because others were denied it. Occasionally, a thrall could buy or earn freedom, but these cases were rare. Some masters manumitted slaves as acts of piety. Others rewarded loyalty with release. But freedom did not erase scars, physical or emotional. Former thralls carried the weight of their suffering, often living as second-class citizens even after manumission. The path out of bondage was so narrow that for most, it was nothing more than a cruel illusion of hope. The silence of the sagas is most damning here. While they sang of heroes and kings, they never described the thousands of thralls who made such lives possible. The daily existence of the enslaved was erased, as though acknowledging it would tarnish the image of Norse honor. This silence was deliberate, a conspiracy of memory that turned suffering into invisibility. The contrast is undeniable. While the sagas praise bravery, the reality for most within Viking society was bondage. While myths exalt independence, prosperity was built on chains. To remember only the ships, raids, and battles is to remember half a truth, the brighter half, carefully polished to hide the darkness. And so, to understand the Vikings fully, we must stand not with the warriors, but with the thralls. For their lives, their fear, their labor, their silence reveal the forbidden side of Norse power that no saga dared to tell. The Viking Age has left behind one of the most seductive myths in history. We picture fearless warriors charging into battle, longships cutting through stormy seas, and explorers venturing farther than anyone dared. We are told stories of honor, kinship, and the rugged freedom of Norse farmers who lived by their own laws. This is the Viking legacy celebrated in sagas, museums, and popular culture, a story of strength, resilience, and discovery. But like all myths, it is incomplete. What the sagas chose to hide, and what history long ignored, is the darker half, an empire of slavery, a society built not only on courage, but on chains. The silence began with the Vikings themselves. The sagas were written by later generations who wanted their ancestors remembered as noble. They glorified raids, but left out the human cost. They sang of voyages to Vinland, but not of the Irish children carried away in chains. They praised kings who built kingdoms, but not the thralls who ploughed their fields. By omitting slavery, the Norse writers created a cleaner story, one in which Vikings embodied freedom and honor, not exploitation and cruelty. This silence shaped how later generations remembered them. In the 19th century, Scandinavian nationalists revived the Viking image to inspire pride and independence. They emphasized exploration, artistry, and warrior spirit, while glossing over slavery as a minor detail. In the 20th century, television and cinema turned Vikings into cultural icons, romantic rebels who lived outside the grip of kings and priests. Today, reenactments and festivals celebrate Viking ships and feasts, rarely mentioning that behind every celebration stood the labor of thralls whose suffering paid for it all. The myth is polished, the darkness buried. Yet archaeology refuses to let the silence stand. Excavations in Dublin revealed cramped holding pens and shackles, Graves unearthed in Sweden and Denmark contain skeletons showing signs of branding and restraint. Along the Volga trade routes, artifacts testify to mass trafficking of captives eastward, where castrated boys and enslaved women were sold to distant markets. DNA studies reveal that many who lived in Viking settlements were not Scandinavian at all, but captives forced to labor, their voices absent from written records. Each discovery chips away at the myth, reminding us that beneath the golden image of Viking independence was a brutal reality of exploitation. Foreign observers were never silent. Arab chroniclers described the cruelty of Norse slave traders with horror. Irish monks wrote of entire monasteries emptied, their brothers marched away in chains. Byzantine sources noted Viking mercenaries who enriched themselves through trafficking as much as through war. These voices confirm what the sagas denied, that slavery was not incidental, but central to Viking power. Their silence was not because it did not happen, but because they did not want it remembered. The forbidden legacy of the Vikings lies in this contradiction. They celebrated freedom while denying it to thousands. They praised honor while profiting from humiliation. They are remembered as explorers who reached new lands, but they were also traffickers who destroyed countless lives. To confront this, truth is to shatter the myth, to see the Vikings not as simple heroes, but as complex figures whose achievements were entangled with cruelty. Why does this matter now? Because history is always selective. Every civilization chooses what to remember and what to bury. Rome remembered its laws but silenced its gladiatorial bloodshed. The Ottomans celebrated their palaces but minimized the horrors of their harems. Even in modern times, nations build monuments to glory while ignoring the suffering that underpins them. The Viking saga of honor and exploration is just one more example of how power preserves what flatters and erases what condemns. To uncover the forbidden Viking legacy is not to deny their accomplishments, but to see them fully. Yes, they were explorers, warriors, and shipbuilders, but they were also slavers, traffickers, and tormentors. Their prosperity was not born only from bravery, but from bondage. Their freedom was purchased with the chains of others. The same longships celebrated in museums carried not just warriors, but human cargo. The same halls where sagas were sung rang with the silence of thralls who served unseen. The same society praised for rugged independence survived on the denial of independence to thousands. This truth is uncomfortable, but it is necessary, because myths, no matter how glorious, are dangerous when left unchallenged. To admire the Vikings without acknowledging their slave empire is to repeat the erasure they began. It is to celebrate freedom without asking who paid the price. It is to honor courage while ignoring cruelty. The forbidden legacy of the Vikings reminds us that history's heroes are rarely untainted. Every saga of glory has a shadow. Every monument of pride rests on suffering. And if we are willing to look past the polished myths, we will find a more honest, if more disturbing, story. One that forces us to confront not only the Vikings, but ourselves. For behind every saga sung, there are voices missing. Voices of the women sold as concubines, the children branded and marched away, the men mutilated for markets abroad. Their silence is the greatest omission in Viking history, and their suffering, the truest legacy of Norse power.